is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the DeFi Decoded podcast. I'm Alex Tapscott here with Andrew Young. Today, we have a very special guest, Rebecca Liao, who is the co-founder and CEO of Saga, a Web3 protocol whose mission it is to give developers what they need to build the next 1,000 chains in the multiverse. Saga automatically provides developers with application-specific blockchains specializing in gaming and entertainment. Since launching last year, they've grown from 0 to 120 projects working on the protocol. And I'm going to read your bio here, Rebecca, because I got a chuckle out of it reading it earlier. It's like reading the bio of 14 different accomplished people. So we'll keep it as short as I can. So Rebecca is also the co-founder, advisor, and former CEO of Skuchain, which is a currency-agnostic blockchain for global trade and a World Economic Forum tech pioneer for 2019. She is currently an advisor to Sommelier Protocol. We had Zaki Manian from that project on a few months ago for listeners of the show. She was also a member of Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign advising on China technology and Asia economic policy, and served on Secretary Hillary Clinton's foreign policy team for her 2016 presidential bid. She also began her career as a corporate attorney for Skadden Arps, which is like the best law firm in the world. She's also a writer and a China analyst, writing for New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, and many more. She's also a graduate of Stanford University and Harvard Law School, and serves on the board of advisors for the Center for a New American Security, and is a co-chair of the Brookings Society, And if that wasn't enough, Rebecca is a jazz and opera singer, which is like amazing.
Not performing today.
Are you an astronaut and like a professional like squash player as well?
No, unfortunately, anything that requires that kind of physical talent is outside my bailiwick. So I do have a weak spot.
Yeah, well, Rebecca, I mean, we're going to dig into what you're doing, but I have to ask, like, how did you come to Web3 given that background? I mean, tell us a little bit about the personal journey first before we dive into what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, Alex, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. DeFi Decode is one of my favorite podcasts in this entire space, and the service that you provide to the community is amazing. So I'm thrilled to be here. In terms of how I got into Web3, so you mentioned I used to be a corporate lawyer, so I always knew that I wanted to leave the full-time practice of law and become a startup entrepreneur. I love technology, and I wanted to start my own business. So my very first startup was called Globality, and it was in the AI space. This is around 2013, 2014 timeframe. And I was part of the early team there, started and ran their BD as well as their Asia operations. And I did that for about a year and a half. It was a lot of fun. SoftBank backed us very quickly, which got us to unicorn status in a short period of time. But that's also, you recognize this, 2014 is when Bitcoin, crypto, DeFi started to become a thing. And what's interesting is I heard so much about it from colleagues who were looking at financial services. And one of my big things is, how do we get more people empowered in the financial sector? How do we make sure that there are more people who are underserved by financial services, able to come into, nevertheless, experience the privilege of having great financial support? And I thought that crypto was the right rails for that. So I read the Bitcoin white paper, got fascinated by it, and started to look around the space, got to know people like Zaki, and decided to leave Globality and co-founded Skuchain. So that's how I got into Web3. It was really through the financial angle. But since then, Web3 has exploded into so many more use cases. And, back then, people were already saying, oh, this is going to be the new internet. I still think that's a little hypey. The old internet still has its place, and we rely on it in Web3 as well. But in terms of being a paradigm shift for how people own their digital lives, I definitely think that this space has a revolutionary place to play.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a big leap. I suppose since you went from being a lawyer to being an entrepreneur, and then that's evolution into Web3, it makes a little bit more sense. But can you talk about like this period of time where you're an entrepreneur, you've learned about Bitcoin, and yet there's years go by where you're, an Asia policy advisor to two of the most powerful politicians in the United States. How did that work? Was that a part-time gig, or were
Yeah.
you take a break to do that? Like, tell us about that period of time.
Yeah. So I never took a break to join a campaign. So I was never on a campaign full time.
Okay.
But I served both Secretary Clinton and President Biden as a foreign policy advisor and tech policy advisor for their campaigns. But both of those gigs were completely part-time. Enormous amount of fun, obviously a great honor. And it's really interesting because I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. We have another presidential campaign coming up as well. But it's a lot of fun. I think for me, as someone who's deeply interested in politics, but also really loves the pace of startup and building, the campaign is the way to go, because I will tell you that the one time I did sort of take a break was in early 2021. So I stepped away from my position at Skuchain. I was co-founder and COO there for 4 years. We got the platform to about 5 billion in annual volume. And I thought, okay, this project is on its way and I'm looking for my next adventure. And Joe Biden won. So I thought, okay, I'm going to move my way to DC. I am going to think very seriously about going into service. And I lived in DC for a few months, going through the interview process, but I called up Zaki actually in the middle of this. And I said, I don't think I'm suited for federal bureaucracy. And he said, no kidding. So that's when I decided, okay, you know what, I think crypto is where my heart and soul is. And so I'd love to come back and start a new thing. But that was the only time that I really stopped out. Otherwise, it was always a part-time thing.
So with that epiphany or that realization, you moved to launch Saga. You mentioned, is that how I'm pronouncing it, by the way?
Saga, yeah.
Saga, yeah. So you started off initially by identifying, Bitcoin and the underlying technology as an opportunity to improve, the financial franchise for people and bring more people into the economy. Is that part of the drive for launching Saga? Like, tell us about that sort of initial launch phase for the project.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, when I was at Skuchain, we were thinking very much on the use case level. We were thinking about applications. And I think that, obviously a lot of Web3 applications have done enormously well in terms of bringing financial freedom, more enfranchisement to people. But I think the realization that hits all of us working in Web3 is that Web3 infrastructure is not really there yet to take it all the way to where we want it to go. And that was really where the inspiration for Saga came about. So when you think about how Web2 infrastructure is readily available to developers, application developers, infra developers, all throughout the digital world, we don't have the same analog in Web3. So in Web3, how it's usually structured is you deploy your applications onto these very, very big chains, whether it's Ethereum or Solana. And the chains have their infrastructure issues, whether that's congestion, slowness of performance. Obviously, the transaction fees for working on these chains is quite high. Those transaction fees get passed along directly to the end users. And so these were 3 big challenges that we wanted to overcome in the next project. And that's how Saga got conceived. So we come from the Cosmos ecosystem, which is the original builder of what we call app chains. It's basically your own dedicated space in which to build. And Cosmos is wonderful for giving you really great infra, but it's very difficult to build in it. And so the whole mission of Saga originally was to just make it easier for developers to have their own space in which to develop their applications and build out Web3. And from that spirit of giving developers the tools that they need and allowing that creativity to flourish, really all of what you see nowadays as Saga came about.
So I was diving into the Saga light paper and sort of just going through. I also saw the recent announcement with Polygon on the sort of helping them with supernets, which is really interesting. That's actually what our project uses as well. So, but I'll dive into that a little bit later. But just to sort of understand more specifically, so Saga essentially helps developers launch their own app chains using Cosmos IBC, or is there some sort of proprietary tech or something like that is built in as well?
Yeah, so the secret behind Saga is the automation. So there are a lot of projects right now that are professing to help you launch your own app chain, but really what it is like you mentioned, Andrew, it is a service. So there are people who gather a validator set for you. So step back a bit. What is necessary for launching your own chain? You need a validator set. So when we think about internet networking, we don't think twice about it because other people have taken care of this problem for us. There are data centers, servers, networking infrastructure that other companies have set up over decades. Whereas in Web3, we use some of that, but really when you stand up a chain, you need to have your own set of validators. And so the challenge for anyone setting that up is, first of all, you got to recruit these validators. They are usually businesses or individual proprietors in their own right. You have to have a security model for this chain. So how are these validators actually going to validate this chain? You probably need a staking token so that you actually can incentivize these validators to provide that security and keep the chain secure. So you need all of those things, which is, sort of you can have that as a business, sort of blockchain as a service, if you will. But we thought, no, it needs to be second nature for developers. I mean, right now, a developer, if you're developing in AWS, you stand up AWS instances like candy. Anytime that you want to, launch a new box, you can do that readily on AWS. You don't think about it. You think about the cost. But as far as everything else, it's completely convenient for you. And we thought that Web3 should provide the same level of support for developers. So how does that relate to Saga? So I would say that Saga is the automated deployment of dedicated block space in crypto. Because we have moved away from just providing app chains, that's why I say dedicated block space. So yes, we provide app chains. These app chains are based on the Cosmos SDK. However, we also provide automated rollups. So rollups as a service, for instance, we're doing side chains as a service as well. So any sort of dedicated block space in crypto, we're able to provide that in an automated way.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was also going through, it sounds like you provide almost like a network of validators that I'm not sure if you guys run them or that's sort of, because obviously standing up your own validator set is, like you said, one of the big challenges. Part of that also is typically validators have to hold the sort of native token. And so you have to get them kind of excited about the underlying project. So how do you allow projects to sort of leverage the sort of, whether it's shared security or just even the individual sort of security provided by validators? Is that something you provide as almost like a marketplace type thing, or do you do that directly?
We do that directly. So we want to abstract infrastructure away from the developer. So we don't want the developer to have to think about it at all. So again, they think about the cost, that's necessary, but they should not have to think about orchestrating that infrastructure or making sure that infrastructure is maintained, et cetera. What a developer does really well is they focus on the application. In our case, because we're focused on gaming and entertainment, people are really thinking about game design. They're thinking about how to make a fun experience for users. They're not thinking about, validator maintenance. And so we want to abstract all of that away from them. So we use this technology in Cosmos called interchain security. It allows chains to share security with one another, primarily to replicate their security models across multiple chains. So when a developer comes to Saga, of course, we have the Saga chain, the Saga mainnet, and it has a security model. It is secured by a set of validators. Now, when a developer comes to us and asks for a dedicated chain, then they're automatically able to get onto their own chain that is secured by the same set of validators as the Saga mainnet and has the same security model as the Saga mainnet. And so we're replicating the security in an automated way. That's how we're able to provide that automation for the developers.
And then going through, that makes a lot of sense. And going through sort of some of the projects that have adopted Saga, it seems like a lot of them are in the sort of, like you said, blockchain gaming, some NFT projects I noticed as well. What do you think, what do you think the first kind of big breakout projects to use this infrastructure are going to be in like sort of what space?
Yeah, so the reason why we focused on gaming and entertainment is, when we think about all the infrastructure problems that underlie Web3, They are common across all applications, but there's a reason why there hasn't been as much of a move for DeFi into this kind of infrastructure, because in DeFi, you are talking about relatively low transaction volumes, and you're talking about pretty high transaction values. So when that's the case, you don't mind congestion as much. You don't notice it as much. You're not as fixated on settlement times, and you are more tolerant of high transaction fees because the value of the transaction is high to begin with. Now, when you switch over to something like gaming and entertainment, it is all about the user experience. And so a lot of these transactions you're talking about, if you have transactions at all, they are microtransactions, or gamers expect them to be free. And so you cannot have these high transaction fees. They certainly cannot be variable. And of course, the response time of the blockchain has to be very high. And so you're looking at much higher quality infrastructure that's much cheaper. And gaming and entertainment needs it the most. And that's why we are focused on that space first. But the way that I just described that, it's much higher quality and cheaper. Obviously, any application in this space can benefit from that. It's just that for gaming and entertainment, it really is existential.
I want to jump in here because I'm trying to think of an analogy to the first era of the web. And, you mentioned a few different services here, like automated deployment of dedicated block space, automated rollups, automated side chains, maintaining a validator set. Like, this is all important stuff, but it's very much Web3 native language. And I think that, if you're, I find the focus on gaming really interesting, because I think what we're seeing now and what we'll continue to see is more and more people who are game developers first and are interested in Web3 because of digital assets or play to earn or whatever the functionality that it offers, but that's not really their homeland. Their homeland is developing games. And in the same way that to launch a website in the 1990s cost tens of thousands of dollars, and businesses maintain their own server racks for storing sensitive information and so forth. But over time, it became easier and easier as these kinds of services re-intermediated to make it easier for businesses. So now you can be a seller of hand sanitizer or whatever, and have a website and have an e-commerce platform and use the web as a way to connect with customers and market your brand, right? And in a way, it's almost like we have the basic functionality of Web3, digital assets, blockchains, and so forth. Those are there, but there's all this other complementary services and infrastructure that needs to get built in order to attract developer talent from maybe outside of the hardcore Web3 circle. And that's a way to drive application development that will probably reach more people too. And I'm just wondering if you think of your mission as helping to build those kinds of bridges to outside of Web3.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's a very clear reason why we analogize ourselves to AWS all the time. It's not necessarily because the business model is identical. I mean, it couldn't possibly be, because we're in Web3 and there's a token and all of that. But in terms of getting to a level of development infrastructure that most developers are familiar with, that is one of our goals. And most developers still reside in Web2, or they come from the Web2 world. Honestly, there are very, very few Web3 developers who have never developed in Web2. I mean, I have yet to find one. And so everyone is quite familiar with the tools that have helped them launch whatever they were building prior to getting into crypto. And so everything that you talked about, Alex, in terms of the cadence of innovation and sort of the cycle by which developers find it easier for them for themselves to deploy new applications onto infrastructure. I mean, that is a cycle of innovation that we are following as well. Yes, it used to be the case that everyone had their own servers. Now it's the case that practically nobody has their own servers. Even Apple will use AWS, for instance. And so you're looking at a model by which you are going to use somebody else's infrastructure, somebody else's automation, somebody else's tooling and services. And that is a huge part of how we have conceived of the developer journey in Web3, for sure.
Right. And so why gaming and entertainment? Is that like a lot of businesses start by specializing in a certain area because they want to be focused and not spread themselves too thin. But is there anything else about that area that attracted you as a place to start with this? Because I mean, you pointed out the difference between, you know, maybe the rate of transaction volume in gaming to say DeFi, and I get that. But beyond that, like, what are there any specific reasons for choosing that a vertical right away?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that in terms of the sectors that urgently needs kind of infrastructure, it was gaming and entertainment. But why is Web3 gaming and entertainment a thing at all? I think that's sort of the broader question. And I think that you know, culturally, Web3 has started to contribute more, I would say, to mainstream than even the upgrades in financial services. I think DeFi is one of those things that really resonates with people who are frustrated with the traditional financial system, whether you are, you know, someone who has means and has worked for a long time, or even if you're someone who's young and feels financially disenfranchised. So DeFi does speak to a huge population. However, I would say that what's happened with NFTs, what's happened with art, what's happened with gaming in Web3 is much more culturally resonant. And why is that? Because I think, you know, you guys know this because you've been in crypto and the Web3 space for a long time. One of the more curious aspects of Web3 is how the industry is organized. I think for a lot of people coming directly from Web2, one of the things they have to get accustomed to is the fact that community is everything in our space. And whether you belong to a certain ecosystem matters a great deal, whether you're across ecosystems matters a great deal. And the community aspect is actually something that really resonates with the times because you're trying to find that authenticity. You're trying to find that group of people that you really belong to, whom you can actually form connections with. And what pandemic really accelerated was that these groups of people are not necessarily people you know in real life. Sometimes you meet them, sometimes you don't, but nevertheless, the connections are real and they're there. So I think gaming and entertainment really captures that cultural feeling in that moment. And that's why you're seeing that explosion. I wouldn't say necessarily, and you know, we love all the innovators that are building on Saga. I think that there are so many amazing game designers and NFT designers that are coming into Web3. But in terms of, you know, product quality, we're climbing the mountain. We're still getting there. But in terms of that feeling of wanting to participate in that creative journey, to be a part of decentralized generation of content, I mean, that is what Web3 gaming and entertainment really captures. It's a very young movement, but it's a movement that has a lot of broad resonance. And so that's why we're seeing the explosive growth in this space. Yes, it's a great fit for our infra, but why are we leaning into it? Because, I mean, we think that for the moment, that is the best thing that Web3 has to offer to the world.
So one thing we spend a ton of time on this podcast sort of talking about is looking at which sort of narratives are taking place, which L1s are gaining market share.
Yeah.
We've actually had a ton of guests from the Cosmos ecosystem on, as well as some from sort of the Solana ecosystems and Avalanche and Polygon as well. Yeah. I sort of mentioned earlier, I saw Saga, to me, at least on sort of the website and everything, it seems like it's very much focused on the Cosmos ecosystem. But I did notice that obviously the announcement with Polygon Supernets, which is sort of Polygon's version of launching your own app chain. Yeah, and it's something that I'm very familiar with because we actually at SX we actually use it as well. But so taking all of that into account, from your perspective, which of these ecosystems, sort of Cosmos, Polygon, Avalanche, which one do you think is sort of winning the app chain war, if you want to call it that? Yeah. Or which ones are you kind of most excited about? Because a lot of our listeners are obviously trying to figure out where things are moving towards. So it would be really helpful to get sort of an operator's perspective on, at least from the technical side and adoption side.
Yeah, absolutely.
What you're most excited about.
Yeah. So the reason we come from Cosmos, it's because of the lifelong connection with Cosmos. A lot of the co-founding team came from the core team at Cosmos. I did not originally come from Cosmos, but Zaki and I were co-founders in our very first crypto startup. So that's where the connection comes from. But I've always believed in the app chain thesis. Monolithic chains do not scale. So, it's, again, analogizing to what happened with Web2 and the internet. It is not enough to just build fatter pipes for your network. You have to start to modularize your network. And that is what the app chain thesis is all about. So Cosmos believed in this from the very beginning. I mean, that's why Cosmos was founded, was to launch a protocol that was not a chain. So Cosmos is not a chain. That's the biggest misconception. Cosmos is an SDK, and it allows you to launch your own chain. So it enables developers to get onto their own space. It believed in this from the get-go, which was, God, almost a decade ago now. And so it's been working on the app chain technology stack for that entire period of time. So when we think about what is battle tested, what is robust, when you're trying to build your own app chain, it really is Cosmos. There are many other ecosystems. You mentioned Polygon, Avalanche has their own version of this, Binance. I mean, most other chains are starting to come up with some sort of app chain solution. But the thing is, the analogy that I make is, okay, so, you're starting on this journey. You're at point A, you're trying to reach the top of the mountain. You can see the top of the mountain, but that doesn't mean that you can forego all the steps that you need to take to get there. And so Cosmos is already sort of halfway up that mountain. Everyone else is still going on that road. So I would say that, all the problems that Cosmos ran into as we were trying to make app chains more robust, easier to use, other protocols are inevitably running into the same issues. And it's not so simple as, well, Cosmos solved it in this way, therefore we can just sort of copy pasta what they did. You have to actually go through that coding challenge of making it work for your particular stack. So what we're saying to these ecosystems, actually, because at Saga, yes, we do come from Cosmos, but you can see from the variety of people that we have building on Saga, we welcome in people from Solana, we welcome in people from Avalanche, from Ethereum, from other ecosystems, from Polygon in particular. I'll talk a little bit later about how that works, how is it that we're able to welcome everybody on, but we have generalized our stack to the point where if you have a protocol and the protocol has some sort of concept of an app chain or a side chain or a roll up or any sort of consumer chain, if you will, then we're able to automatically deploy that. And that's why we are partnering with people like Polygon. There are other announcements coming down the pike. We partnered with Celestia early this year to do roll-ups as a service. So the idea is it doesn't really matter which ecosystem you come from. If you have a stack where you have a concept of an app chain, then we are able to automatically deploy that on your behalf.
Interesting. I'm trying to think. Maybe this is I'm reaching the limit of my technical ability, but how is it that you're able to so seamlessly integrate with all these different chains? That's the one question I have, because we run into this composability issue between different environments, and I understand that Cosmos and IBC, the model is more open, but still there's friction points. How is it that you're actually able to be almost chain agnostic and providing the service set to providers?
Yeah. So I would highlight three things there, Alex. So first and foremost, I would say on the tech front, IBC is key to this. So Cosmos IBC, for those who are unfamiliar, stands for Inter-Blockchain Communication. It is the interoperability protocol that Cosmos conceived. And I think it's a signature achievement of Cosmos over and above the SDK that allows you to launch your own chain. So IBC is like TCP IP for blockchain. It is a messaging protocol, so it's not a bridge. There are no assets that are being locked on IBC. So when one chain wants to transfer assets to another chain, both chains have to make that communication in a secure way across IBC, and then the transfer happens. I think to date there have been, about 500 billion assets that have gone across IBC, and there have been no security issues at all. So it's a really great way in which blockchains can communicate with one another. Now, that's just for the transfer of assets. IBC is coming up with new innovations in terms of interchain accounts as well, that'll allow for general messaging between chains. So it's not just the transfer of assets. There are smart contract messages that can go back and forth as well, and we're taking advantage of that technology. Bridges do play a part, however. So within the world of Cosmos, IBC is readily available. But when we're trying to bridge back to Ethereum or to Solana, for instance, that's when we actually do need to use a bridging service. And we work with people like Axelar, for instance, who have just been proven to be able to provide that service very securely. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it, I would say, is we have one of our big innovations, and if you read that Polygon announcement, we start to go into it a little bit. We have separated the functions of the validator within a chain. So it used to be the case that a validator has to do all the different parts of the stack of the chain. So they have to provide the security, for instance. They have to provide all the uptime for that particular chain. They have to orchestrate their operations in order to keep the chain alive. Now, what we're saying is, okay, you have the security model for the validators, and that is what incentivizes them to provide these services. But then you have the actual validator operations themselves. And with Polygon, what we've started to do is we've separated the two. So Polygon, obviously, they have their own validator set. These validators have been loyal to them. They expect rewards for being a part of the system. So they will continue to validate the supernets. However, on the Saga side, our chainlet technology, the dedicated chains on Saga are called chainlets. The chainlet technology is what is actually orchestrating these supernets, and that is what allows for the automation. So we're starting to separate validator services. So that's another key piece of that seamlessness and integrating with other ecosystems. The third piece, which is probably the most important piece of all, is the economic piece. So why on earth would Polygon give up value accrual on their own token and be on Saga? So we have a two-tier token structure. And this was originally conceived to help developers out, but it has worked out very nicely with our partners as well. So there is a Saga, there will be a Saga token. There's no Saga token yet, boys and girls. Please do not buy any Saga tokens out there thinking it's us. So there's a Saga token, but it's only visible on the back end. So developers do have to pay for these chainlets to keep them alive. Those fees are denominated in Saga tokens, but that is entirely settled between the developers and us on the back end. With respect to the application itself, we are invisible. We do not charge transaction fees directly to the end user. We think that is a terrible user experience, one of the stranger parts of Web3. And so it's really up to the developer to monetize however they like. Now, that is true for individual developers, but that's also true for partners. So for somebody like a Polygon, they can continue to use Matic on the front end. They can continue to accrue value on their token as they normally would, except that now we are horizontally expanding their back end as opposed to them using their own infrastructure. And so that's another key piece of this. So how is it that we're able to partner with other layer ones? They continue to accrue value on their token, but they have more block space in which to do it now. So more block space, more demand on that token. Of course, the buying pressure works out nicely.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I agree with you that, from a user experience, or even from a developer experience, the fewer tokens you have to think about, the better, other than maybe the one that's native to your own application, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's like if you had to pay, if you were a business and you had 10 vendors, and each vendor you had to pay in the token of the vendor, it's like I got to pay now an EY coin and Scad and ARPS coin and the rest of that. So yeah, like I get that. So one more question for you. I know you're not looking to enter government or politics, and you're focused on Saga, but
yeah,
it seems like kind of a big year for Web3 regulation and policy. Yeah. There's been I think pretty much you could say regulators have been kicking the can down the road, and when things flare up, they default to the regulation by enforcement process. And I think there's a lot of bad facts out there. And as they say, bad facts make bad laws. I'm wondering, what's your perspective on the policy picture, the regulatory picture for 2023? Is there an opportunity for a grand bargain, like a telecom act for this new age, or are we going to end up in a scenario where it does more harm than good? Just wondering if you could give us your perspective on that.
Yeah. So after FTX collapsed, I was sitting in this meeting, and it was it's one of those like task forces that are assembled right away after some sort of crisis happens. And what was interesting was that a lot of people were making the exact same arguments that they were making before about whether a token should be considered a security or commodity, for instance, whether there were any, classic, whether there were any national security concerns attached.
Still no answer on that, by the way. I mean, it's like we've been having this debate since 2017, and there's all these different interpretations, and none of them are satisfactory. I don't mean to interrupt, but Hester Pierce gave a speech a couple of months ago where she basically said, like, just from a practical standpoint, it's idiotic to consider token securities, because if we were to do that, then it would take us 400 years to go through the enforcement and registration process for all the tokens that exist. So like, why would we even start there, right? Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And I know that Commissioner Pierce is quite popular within the space, because I think that she's not always on our side, but I think that she is able to think through these issues in a very clear-headed way. And she sincerely tries to understand what's happening in the technology, which is incredibly hard to do, I think, for most regulators, especially because, they're not in the space. It does move incredibly quickly. So much of it is insider baseball. So it's not easy for regulators to really know what's going on. But I would say that of all of them, Commissioner Pierce tends to make more of an effort. And so in this meeting, people were making these exact same arguments. And finally, I've been sitting there for a little while, and I pipe up and say, has the fact that FTX collapsed actually changed the conversation? Because, I'm the sort of person who likes to get to the heart of the matter pretty quickly. Yeah, right. And the room sort of paused, and I said, well, no, it hasn't really. So it's the exact same conversation. Everyone has the same set of beliefs. Everyone has the same set of arguments. However, now it's all just expressed much more loudly, because everyone feels that sense of urgency. We can't have something like this happen all over again. But I will say, so coming out of FTX in particular, I think most regulators, even the ones who are particularly anti-crypto, they recognize that this was not a failure of crypto per se. This was not a failure of blockchain technology. This is a failure of an exchange. And we have seen failures of exchanges throughout the history of the US financial system. So there are known ways to deal with that. But I think crypto remains a challenge for regulators, to be perfectly honest. I know that there's a certain level of activity that's happening around it, but I think until crypto becomes an election issue, it's not going to have any serious activity on it. Yes, there will be some things here and there that are consequential, and when regulators make certain statements or when they give certain guidance, then of course that's going to trickle down to the lawyers, and the lawyers are going to give certain advice to the projects in terms of how to behave. But in terms of real action, I mean, I would say this: before you see any real action on crypto, you got to see real action in tech in general. And you see the political willingness to regulate somebody like a Meta, for instance, or a Google. Once you see some real action there, then I think crypto is sort of next in line. But there are bigger fish to fry, honestly, right now.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, while they're off frying other fish, we let the builders build. And what you're doing with Saga is really interesting. Thanks so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. That was a terrific conversation. And we look forward to speaking with you again, maybe 6 months down the road, when you've gone from 0 to 120 to 1,000 or more. And we're really keen on the gaming thesis. We have been for a year and a half. I think a lot of the early games were a little too insider baseball, to use your expression. They're very crypto oriented, very play to earn focused, and less focused on play. So I think that bringing more gaming native developers into the space is going to improve that part of the industry. And I think that the infra you're providing here on the back end to make that process simpler and easier for developers, I think is really critical to that too. So it's good and important work that you're doing too, to help grow Web3 to a much bigger audience. So thanks again. We appreciate it. That concludes today's episode of DeFi Decoded. Rebecca, thanks again. Andrew, pleasure as always. We will see everybody next week. Until then, take care.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's a ton of fun. Thank you.
Thanks.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.